Hey guys, tonight we wander through a landscape that's still trying to remember how to breathe again. The year is sometime after the Great Famine, and you can smell the ghosts of hunger before you even open your eyes. The morning mist rolls across the empty fields, pale and exhausted, like it too hasn't eaten in years. Birds sit silent on the skeletons of trees that never recovered, and the air feels thick with a sort of memory. It's like the land itself is replaying a bad dream. You step outside your small thatched cottage, your boots sinking into mud that used to be fertile soil, and realize how strange it is to live where so many didn't. There's no glory in surviving this long. It feels more like an accident. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first breath of this new world tastes like smoke and sour rye, and when you look down the road toward the neighboring village, you can see the faint trail of dust rising where carts once carried bodies instead of grain. That's the thing about recovery. It looks a lot like survival with slightly better lighting. You trudge past the well, which still creaks like an old man trying to tell a joke no one remembers the punchline to, and the smell of algae clings to your clothes. People whisper about the famine as if it were a ghost that might overhear them. "Don't mention it," one woman says while scrubbing a pot. "It listens." And maybe she's right, because every time someone says harvest, the wind shifts and the crows start circling again. It's not just about empty stomachs. It's about the hollowed-out rhythm of living fields left untended, tools rusting in sheds, laughter too expensive to afford. You see one old farmer sharpening his scythe even though the weeds barely reach his knees. He says he does it to keep the land from forgetting his name. That's the kind of poetry you get when there's nothing left to eat. Historically, of course, the Great Famine. Take your pick, Ireland in the 1840s or Europe in the 1310s, wasn't just about weather or blight. It was about systems collapsing under their own weight. One mainstream historical fact: the medieval Great Famine of 1315–1317 was triggered by relentless rain, rotting crops and livestock disease, which together reduced Europe's population by millions. Imagine trying to farm while the sky basically decides it's soup season forever. The soil gave up, and people followed. But here's a quirky tidbit historians rarely linger on. Some chroniclers claimed that desperate villagers tried to grind tree bark into bread, calling it wooden meal, and shared rumors that it gave you the strength of oaks. Spoiler, it didn't. It mostly gave you splinters in your gums. And yet, the human need to pretend that things can still be fixed, that's what keeps the story going. Scholars still debate whether the famine changed social structures permanently or just temporarily shook them up. Did it make peasants more independent because they had nothing left to lose, or did it break them so completely that obedience became their safest meal? No one agrees, and that's kind of comforting. It means history, like hunger, doesn't always come with a clean ending. You keep walking, passing a row of abandoned cottages that now host moss and mice as their newest tenants. In one window, a child's wooden doll still stares out with a painted smile, the kind that probably made more sense before the world went quiet. You pick it up, brush off the dust, and for a moment you can almost feel the echo of laughter that once filled this place. Then a gust of wind rushes through the fields, cold enough to remind you that the earth hasn't forgiven anyone yet. Somewhere nearby, someone is baking again. Finally, the faint smell of coarse bread drifts through the air, and your stomach growls like it's auditioning for a tragic opera. You smile despite yourself. Maybe this is how healing begins. Not with a miracle, but with yeast. You take another step, feel the damp soil stick to your boots, and glance at the gray sky that refuses to brighten. Well, you murmur, at least it's not raining. The clouds, of course, take that personally. A fat drop hits your nose. You laugh, the first real laugh in a while, and think, maybe the land remembers laughter too. The world after famine isn't heroic. It's fragile, ridiculous, and occasionally funny in the way life insists on being. But it's yours, and you're still here to taste it. You wake the next morning to the sound of something you haven't heard in years. Someone singing while they work. It's faint, off-key, and drifting through the mist like a rumor that refuses to die. You follow it to the edge of the fields where a handful of villagers are bent over the earth, hands dark with soil, faces streaked with determination and leftover grief. They're replanting, carefully, nervously, like someone trying to trust an ex who swore they've changed. Each handful of seed falls like a prayer, small, round, and trembling between faith and foolishness. The famine took nearly everything: people, livestock, faith, and patience, but not seeds, apparently. A few were hoarded in clay jars beneath floorboards, hidden away like relics of a better time. You can feel the hesitation in the air as one old woman holds up a handful of barley and says, "It remembers us." Maybe she's right. Maybe the soil keeps score. The first drops of rain start to fall, and no one moves. Everyone watches the sky as if it might change its mind. You crouch down, press your hand to the mud, and realize how strange it feels to ask the same earth that betrayed you to love you again. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks at a scarecrow. It's not a good scarecrow. It's made of a single broom handle, a shirt with more holes than fabric, and a turnip with a face carved by someone who's clearly not slept in weeks. But it's there, standing proud and ridiculous, a perfect metaphor for hope itself. Historically, one mainstream fact fits this moment perfectly. After the Great Famine of 1315–1317, agricultural recovery across Europe took decades, and many communities shifted to hardier crops like rye and oats to avoid another collapse. You can imagine medieval farmers staring at wheat like it was an unreliable boyfriend. Promises abundance, disappears at the first sign of rain. So they moved on. But here's a strange little tidbit that doesn't make it into most textbooks. Some chroniclers swore that desperate peasants began planting herbs like parsley, sage, and even mint in graveyards, believing the restful soil made plants grow faster. It's a bit morbid, sure, but you can't fault their logic after all. The ground there was well fed. Whether or not that ever worked, who knows? Scholars still argue about whether the famine caused a long-term agricultural revolution or just a temporary shift in panic planting. One theory suggests that the trauma of starvation made peasants more experimental, leading to small innovations in crop rotation and soil drainage. Another insists it was just dumb luck. Either way, the first sprouts poking through the dirt now feel almost supernatural. You reach down and brush one with your fingers. It's soft, green, defiant. You could cry if you weren't so dehydrated. A nearby farmer jokes that if these crops fail again, he'll just start raising frogs instead. At least they sing before you eat them, he says, grinning with teeth the color of dark bread. The others laugh, but the sound is brittle, like glass that might shatter at any moment. Still, laughter counts. It's the first sign that famine hasn't won completely. You notice how the village smells different now. Wet grain, smoke, and a hint of something almost sweet, like possibility mixed with manure. Children chase each other between furrows, their shouts echoing against the empty hills, and you realize you haven't heard joy that loud in years. The soil squelches under your boots, sticky but alive, and for once the rain doesn't feel like a punishment. "We'll call this season the forgiving one," someone says. You nod, though you're not sure the earth forgives so easily. There's a quiet ritual to all of this, scraping mud from shovels, whispering blessings into seed sacks, pretending not to see the patches where bones still turn up in the dirt. The famine left no one untouched, and yet everyone is pretending it did. That's how survival works. You plant over the memories and hope they stay buried. You think of that ridiculous scarecrow again, the one with the turnip head, and for a second it almost seems to wink at you. You again, you mutter, "Don't worry, I'm not eating you." The wind laughs, or maybe it's just the crows being sarcastic. You glance toward the hills where the last famine fires once burned, and try to imagine them green again. The thought feels dangerous but good, like singing at a funeral. You walk back toward the cottages, the sound of shovels clinking fading behind you, and realize that hope doesn't come all at once. It comes in fragments. One seed, one breath, one stubborn act of planting when everything told you not to. You smile to yourself. Maybe this is what healing looks like: muddy boots and bad singing. You wake to the scent of wood smoke and damp straw, the smell of civilization trying to remember what warmth feels like. The air is thick with the rhythmic thud of hammers, the creak of wagon wheels hauling timber, and the occasional swear muffled by sawdust. Villagers are rebuilding, one crooked beam at a time, as if patching up the body of a giant that nearly starved to death. You stand in the middle of the village square, which is more mud puddle than meeting place, and watch as people drag salvaged beams from old ruins, the wood so warped it looks like it's flinching. One man nails together a door frame with the confidence of someone who's never built anything but won't admit it. If it leans, he says proudly, it's artistic. You nod, pretending not to notice the angle of the roof that could double as a slide. The Great Famine didn't just take food, it took the idea of home. When half the village disappears, even walls start to feel haunted. You can almost hear the echoes of pots clanging, babies crying, fires crackling, all the small noises that make a place human. Now as smoke curls upward again from newly lit hearths, it feels like the world is cautiously exhaling. Historically, rebuilding after famine was as much psychological as physical. One mainstream historical fact: in post-famine Europe, many peasants constructed smaller, single-room homes to retain warmth and conserve resources, a practical shift that also symbolized a simpler, humbler existence. It's funny how tragedy can redesign architecture. You watch a young couple argue over where to put the fireplace, and you can tell this isn't really about fireplaces. It's about control, comfort, and pretending that life makes sense again. "Facing east brings luck," she insists. "Facing east brings smoke in my face," he replies. You quietly back away before being recruited as a referee. Somewhere nearby, someone is painting a new sign for the tavern, even though there's nothing to serve but weak ale and boiled roots. The sign reads, "The Rising Hearth." Not bad, you think. A little optimistic, maybe, but optimism is contagious here. Like laughter or lice, the villagers rebuild in uneven harmony. Some houses have fancy windows reclaimed from a noble's abandoned estate. Others are just patched huts with thatched holes that let in both air and gossip. Children chase each other with sticks pretending to be builders, occasionally hitting actual builders, which doesn't go over well. The rhythm of reconstruction is almost musical. Hammer, cough, laugh, hammer, sigh. You pass by an elderly woman sitting by her half-built cottage, singing softly to the rhythm of her weaving. Her hands move like she's braiding the air itself. She tells you she's weaving insulation out of old rags because ghosts hate bright colors. You don't question it. Who would? After what she's seen. Here's a quirky little tidbit. In some famine-stricken parts of medieval Europe, villagers believed that smoke from the first fire in a rebuilt home carried away bad spirits, so they would deliberately burn a pinch of salt or hair to seal the hearth's luck. It sounds strange until you realize that everyone's just trying to control the uncontrollable. You can almost taste the superstition in the air. It's smoky, salty, and slightly desperate. And scholars still debate what this rebuilding meant socially. Did it mark the rebirth of communities or merely their reorganization under tighter feudal control? Some argue that after famine, landlords used the chaos to consolidate power, turning surviving peasants into more dependent tenants. Others claim the opposite, that with so many gone, Labor shortages forced the powerful to treat workers better. No one agrees, of course, and you suspect the truth lived somewhere in the muddy middle. You lean against a half-built fence, watching sparks leap from a blacksmith's forge as he shapes nails for someone's roof. He whistles an old tune, something about rain or luck or both, and for the first time it sounds like music again, not mourning. The hammer hits metal with a clean rhythm that makes your chest ache a little. You can feel warmth sneaking back into the bones of this place. One man jokes that rebuilding is just revenge against weather, and everyone laughs. A child throws a clump of mud at his father and yells, "You missed a spot." The father grins, wipes his brow, and says, "So did the famine." It's a clumsy, beautiful kind of defiance. By the time the sun dips low, the village looks different. Not whole, not healed, but alive. Smoke rises from crooked chimneys, and through the open doors you can see people gathered around their new hearths, faces glowing like small miracles. You stand at the edge of the square, listening to the murmurs and the crackle of fires, and realize that warmth, real warmth, isn't just heat. It's sound, smell, laughter, life. You close your eyes and let the smoke sting a little. It smells like home, or at least the promise of one. The church bells ring for the first time in months, and the sound feels heavier than it used to, like every note is dragging the memory of the dead along for the ride. You stand outside the small stone chapel as villagers shuffle in, heads bowed, boots squelching in the wet dirt, each one clutching some kind of offering, a handful of barley, a lump of tallow, a few sad coins that look embarrassed to be seen in daylight. The famine may have broken bodies, but it didn't break faith. If anything, it made it hungrier. The priest stands at the doorway, his robes patched at the elbows, his expression halfway between compassion and tax collection. He blesses each person with a weary hand, murmuring words that sound less like Latin and more like sighs. You step inside, and the smell hits you: wax, mildew, and the faint sweetness of rot. The wooden pews creak like they too are praying to survive another season. A child sneezes. The echo is almost holy. The priest begins his sermon about gratitude, humility, and the lessons of suffering, which, if you're being honest, sounds like a polite way of saying don't complain. Historically, one mainstream fact comes to mind. After the Great Famine of 1315–1317, the Church's influence surged across Europe as desperate populations sought meaning in catastrophe, interpreting the famine as divine punishment for moral decay. It's funny how tragedy always makes people religiously punctual. You glance at the villagers, their faces pale and solemn, and you realize that belief isn't just about heaven, it's about order. When the world turns unpredictable, a bit of organized mystery feels comforting. The priest gestures toward the crucifix and tells everyone to thank God for sparing them. You can't help but notice he says it without mentioning the ones God didn't spare. Then comes the collection bowl, passed hand to hand like a slow confession. You drop in your coin, which lands with a hollow clink that sounds suspiciously like guilt. The bowl reaches the front again, heavier than it should be, and the priest nods, visibly relieved. Even faith, it seems, has a budget. You wander outside after the service, blinking in the light, and see the priest inspecting a new shipment of candles while lecturing two boys about sin. One boy's face says he's guilty of something, though probably not what the priest thinks. Light is the Lord's reminder that he still sees you, the priest says, even in the dark. The boy mutters, "I wish he'd blink." You have to cough to hide your laugh. Here's a quirky little tidbit that historians love to debate. In some famine-stricken parishes, clergy supposedly sold small pieces of blessed bread baked from grain grown on consecrated land, claiming it prevented future hunger. Some say it was pure superstition. Others think it was clever marketing centuries before advertising existed. You can just imagine a medieval jingle, holy loaf for souls and stomachs alike. Yet not everyone bought into it. literally or spiritually. Scholars still argue about whether the Church's dominance during this recovery was genuinely driven by faith or opportunism. Some point to the explosion of new monasteries and pilgrimages as proof of spiritual revival. Others call it a consolidation of power dressed in incense and scripture. You can't help thinking it was probably both. Religion, like bread, always tastes better when you're starving. That night, you join a small crowd gathered outside the chapel for the first candlelight vigil since the famine ended. Flames flicker across faces still half-starved and half-hopeful. And for a moment, the village looks like it's glowing from within. The priest leads a hymn about renewal, his voice trembling but steady, and the sound spreads through the crowd like a gentle infection. You hum along, even though you don't know the words, and realize that sometimes faith isn't about belief, it's about harmony. It's about standing next to someone and pretending together that the world makes sense. When the candles burn low, the priest blesses the fields again, flinging droplets of holy water into the air that smell faintly of salt and smoke. May the soil forgive us, he intones. You look toward the dark horizon where tomorrow's crops are sleeping under cold stars, and for once the silence feels less like absence and more like listening. You think maybe the land is ready to forgive, just slowly and only if no one brags about it. You wake one morning to find that the air smells of ink, sweat, and bureaucracy, never a good combination. Word has spread that new laws have arrived from the capital, carried on the back of a weary courier who looks like he's been chased here by the ghost of famine itself. He slumps into the village square, unrolls a parchment longer than most sermons, and starts reading in a voice that suggests even he doesn't believe a word of it. The villagers gather, squinting at the official seal stamped in red wax, and you can almost feel the collective groan ripple through the crowd. The crown, apparently, has decided to ensure future stability by enforcing new rules on land, grain storage, and trade. Translation: the government has entered its "we're helping" era, which historically means no one's about to have a good time. You fold your arms and listen as he reads about grain quotas, taxes on livestock, and this one gets a laugh, mandatory inspections of root cellars to prevent hoarding. Someone mutters, "Aye, because we're just swimming in spare potatoes." You catch the priest's smirk before he hides it behind a cough. Still, nobody dares to argue too loudly. Everyone remembers what hunger can do. One mainstream historical fact fits this perfectly. In the aftermath of the Great Famine, several European kingdoms, including England and France, enacted strict food storage and trade regulations designed to prevent artificial scarcity. In theory, these laws were meant to stabilize prices and encourage fairness. In practice, they often punished the poor for surviving creatively. You can picture a royal scribe somewhere, dipping his quill and writing, "Peasants shall not hoard grain," while sitting next to a banquet table groaning under roast swans. The irony could feed an entire village. Still, for every angry mutter, there's also a nervous kind of gratitude, because laws, however heavy-handed, at least mean someone's paying attention again. Authority is back, and it's wearing polished boots. The local reeve, newly important, struts around like a rooster in borrowed armor. He measures granaries with a stick that's clearly too short, then writes something solemn in his ledger just to look busy. "Order," he announces, "must be maintained." You resist the urge to ask whether order comes with supper. Here's a quirky tidbit that doesn't often make it into textbooks. In some famine-scarred regions, local lords introduced grain oaths, ceremonies where villagers had to swear before the altar not to conceal food. The priest would sprinkle holy water on the sacks of barley, and anyone whose grain hissed under the drops was accused of greed. Spoiler: grain always hisses when wet. It's basically science's way of trolling superstition, but people believed it anyway, because fear was the only currency left that everyone could afford. Scholars still debate what these post-famine laws really accomplished. Some argue they helped rebuild economies and reduced waste, forcing fairer distribution. Others call them moral theater, a way for rulers to reassert control under the guise of compassion. Maybe both are true. Maybe compassion with paperwork is just how governments cope with guilt. You wander over to the tavern that evening, where talk of the new rules mixes with the smell of smoke and stew. So we can't store more than 3 barrels now, a farmer grumbles. Good thing rats don't read. Another raises his mug. To the king may his wheat never get damp. The laughter that follows is dangerous but necessary. People need to joke or they'll scream. Outside, a few children play tax collector, chasing each other with sticks and shouting, "Declare your grain." It's both hilarious and mildly terrifying. You sip your ale, listening to the low hum of resentment that's as steady as the rain outside. Everyone's pretending to adapt, but under the surface there's a quiet defiance brewing, the kind that grows best in dark, damp corners. When you leave, the road glistens under torchlight, and you spot the courier already asleep by his horse, his satchel still stuffed with unopened decrees for the next village. Poor man doesn't know he's delivering disappointment in bulk. You look back at your own tiny plot of land and think about the granary you've carefully stocked, barely enough for winter, but still more than some. The thought of a stranger inspecting it makes your stomach twist. You sigh, glance at the cloudy moon and whisper, "Order must be maintained," just to hear how ridiculous it sounds. The night answers with a single owl's hoot that translates roughly to, "Good luck with that." By the next full moon, the village hums again. Not with hunger this time, but with something stranger, something livelier, music. It starts quietly, almost shyly, from a single cottage where a young man plucks a few uneven notes on a battered lute. And then, as if the sound itself is contagious, other voices join in. Before long, the square is alive with song. It's the first real music you've heard since before the famine, and it feels almost indecent, like laughter at a funeral that went on too long. But that's the thing about survival. It eventually demands a soundtrack. You sit near the fire pit, watching as villagers gather in small clusters, the glow of the flames painting their faces gold and pink. Someone passes a jug of ale that tastes mostly like regret, but still burns pleasantly on the way down. They sing about cows that ran away, fields that drowned, and saints who forgot their job descriptions. The lyrics are chaotic, hilarious, and heartbreakingly human. A one-eyed fiddler taps his boot and grins. If we can't fill our stomachs, we'll fill the silence instead. Historically, one mainstream fact fits snugly here. After the Great Famine of the early 14th century, folk music flourished across rural Europe, preserving memories of loss and endurance in song form. These ballads, half prayer, half comedy, became communal therapy sessions disguised as entertainment. When words couldn't heal, melody did. You realize now why the villagers sing so loudly. It's not just joy, it's defiance. The famine took their food but not their rhythm. And then comes the strange part. A group of women begin clapping in perfect unison, their palms slapping time against their knees, and someone starts stomping along. Soon, even the stoic Reeve, the grain quota fame, joins in. Badly, but enthusiastically, like a man trying to flirt with rhythm. You can't help laughing. The fiddler notices you and calls out, "Got a story in you, traveler?" You raise your hands. "Only sad ones." He nods. "Good, those sell best." Here's a quirky tidbit most historians skip over. In several famine-era villages, people actually composed famine carols, darkly comic songs that mocked bad harvests and corrupt officials. One French verse famously thanked the king for his invisible bread, while another Irish tune swore that rain is the devil's soup. You can almost imagine the church's disapproval echoing across the centuries. Yet even priests couldn't stop it. Humor, once set to melody, travels faster than sermons. Scholars still argue whether these songs were genuine social resistance or just harmless release. Did laughter challenge power or merely make suffering tolerable? It's an open debate, and one that feels oddly modern. Sitting here with the fire crackling and voices rising, you decide it's both defiance and distraction are sometimes the same song in a different key. A boy no older than 12 begins to drum on an overturned bucket, keeping tempo as if he's born for this. His mother sways beside him, smiling a smile you haven't seen on her face since the famine's worst days. The lyrics shift from mourning to mischief. Now they're singing about a farmer who fell asleep in his field and woke up married to a goat. The crowd howls. Someone adds a verse about the priest's suspiciously full pantry, and even he chuckles, shaking his head like a man forgiving a sin too funny to punish. You notice that the longer they sing, the lighter everyone seems. The air itself feels less haunted. The sound of voices in harmony, raw, untrained, glorious, is like the village remembering its own heartbeat. You hum along quietly, and for the first time in a long while, the tune doesn't sound foreign in your mouth. It's as if the land is singing through you, grateful and exhausted. Later, when the fire burns low and the songs slow down into murmured lullabies, someone begins a melody you've never heard before, a soft chant that sounds older than words. It's about survival, though it never says the word aloud. You close your eyes and the night wraps around you like a blanket. The flames flicker, shadows sway, and the stars above seem to listen, holding their breath. When the final note fades, no one claps. They just sit there, quiet and full, as if the song fed them more than bread ever could. You take a deep breath, tasting ash, ale, and something like hope. Survival, you realize, isn't silent. It hums. It always has. The morning after the music fades, you wake to the low murmur of gossip drifting through the village like a chill breeze. Someone's cow gave sour milk, another's bread refused to rise, and a child down the lane has been feverish for 3 nights. Under normal skies, these would be ordinary troubles. But here, in a world still trembling from hunger, everything ordinary feels ominous. By noon, the whispers have grown teeth. There's talk of curses, of someone angering the saints, or worse, of old magic stirring again beneath the fields. You walk through the square and can sense it, the mix of fascination and fear that always accompanies the idea that something unseen might still be controlling the harvest. It's her, someone mutters near the well, pointing discreetly toward an old widow who keeps a black cat and talks to her herbs like friends. She was untouched by the famine, they say. Her pantry never emptied. You glance at the woman in question, bent over her garden, humming softly, and she looks more tired than terrifying. Still, fear has a way of finding its favorite targets. Historically, it's not far off. One mainstream historical fact is that after the Great Famine of 1315–1317, records across Northern Europe show an increase in accusations of witchcraft long before the great witch trials of later centuries. When crops failed and prayers didn't work, people looked for someone mortal to blame. You can practically hear the logic forming. If God won't explain it, maybe Martha next door will. The priest, perhaps sensing opportunity, delivers a sermon that afternoon about vigilance and sin. He warns that the devil is clever and may walk disguised in kindness, which is impressive because you could say the same about half the village council. The people nod solemnly, gripping their rosaries like tiny shields. You feel the temperature drop, not in the air, but in the collective mood. Fear is back, and it's cheaper than bread. You stop by the widow's cottage later, partly out of curiosity and partly because she's the only person in the village who seems entirely unbothered by all this nonsense. Her cat eyes you suspiciously from the windowsill, and she chuckles. Don't worry. He only curses people on Tuesdays. She invites you in, pours a thin brew of herbs that tastes like rain and smoke, and shrugs when you mention the rumors. They always need a monster, she says, and monsters always look like whoever's standing alone. You sip the tea and think about how easily hunger rewires faith into fear. When people have nothing left to lose, they start trading reason for superstition, because at least superstition offers answers, even bad ones. Here's a quirky tidbit. During the famine, some villagers supposedly carried rain charms made from frogs' legs tied with flax, or placed bowls of milk at crossroads to appease wandering spirits of the weather. It sounds absurd until you remember that desperation makes creativity look like madness in hindsight. The widow shows you one of her charms, just a bundle of dried rosemary bound with red thread, and laughs. It's not for weather, she says, it's for memory. So I don't forget the ones I lost. There's something disarming about her honesty, something too human for witchcraft. As you leave her home, the setting sun turns the sky a bruised orange, and from somewhere behind you you hear muttered prayers mixing with nervous laughter. Scholars still debate whether these eruptions of superstition helped or harmed communities after the famine. Some argue they gave people a sense of control, a way to process collective trauma. Others say they poisoned villages with paranoia, isolating the very people who held practical wisdom about healing and food preservation. Looking around now, you can see both arguments sprouting side by side like weeds in a neglected garden. The next day, a boy tosses a pebble at the widow's door, runs and trips over his own guilt. His mother scolds him in public, but later you see her crossing herself when the cat stares too long in her direction. Fear never fully leaves. It just changes costume. That night, as you walk home through the mist, you catch yourself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see something moving between the trees, something old and clever and hungry. The wind rustles through the reeds near the pond, and for a brief moment it sounds almost like whispering. You shake your head, laugh softly, and tell yourself you don't believe in such things. But when you reach your cottage, you find a sprig of rosemary tied with red thread resting on your doorstep. You stare at it for a long while, then pick it up and place it on your windowsill beside a candle. Maybe it's protection, maybe it's friendship. Either way, it smells of something rare in this place. Understanding. You blow out the candle, and the faint scent lingers in the dark, earthy and alive. The cat's distant meow follows you into sleep, like a reminder that fear and kindness often share the same shape in the dark. By the time spring fully settles into the village, you notice a new kind of life stirring. Not crops, not livestock, but children, the true survivors of absence. These are the ones born during or just after the famine, small and wiry, their cheeks flushed with stubborn vitality instead of starvation. They chase each other through the muddy lanes, barefoot, giggling at the occasional goat that wanders too close or the crows that mock them from the rooftops. You watch as one boy leaps over a puddle, nearly wiping out, and the girl next to him yells, "Do it again," because falling is apparently fun if it's someone else. The children have no memory of hunger that lingers like smoke in the adult mind. For them, survival is instinctive and playful, a game with rules they've never needed to learn. You feel a pang of envy. The adults still carry the famine like a weight in their shoulders, but these kids skip and tumble as if it's physically impossible to remember that absence. Historically, one mainstream fact fits here neatly. After the Great Famine of 1315–1317, birth rates initially plummeted, but within a few years populations rebounded, and these post-famine children often grew up healthier than their famine-stricken parents, benefiting from slightly more abundant conditions. You walk alongside a group of them who are trying to balance on a fallen tree trunk like tightrope walkers. One of them wobbles, falls in the mud, and yells, "I'm fine," which is true and absurd at the same time. It's almost as if joy itself is a defiance of memory. Some of these kids carry toys that adults barely remember making. Little wooden animals, scraps of cloth stitched into dolls, stones arranged in patterns that look like tiny towns. There's a creativity born not of wealth but of survival, a sort of innocence sharpened by necessity. Here's a quirky tidbit. Chroniclers of post-famine villages often noted that children would invent elaborate games around agricultural tasks, pretending to sow seeds, harvest, or guard fields from imaginary beasts. It's both training and play, practical and absurd, simultaneously teaching them survival and providing comic relief for everyone else. You notice a small group of girls singing a rhythm that mimics the sound of sowing seeds. Their voices rise and fall, cheerful and untrained, a melody that seems older than the earth itself. Scholars still debate how much the famine shaped this generation's behavior. Did scarcity instill resourcefulness and resilience, or did it leave hidden anxieties and superstitions passed down through playful rituals? No one agrees. For now, it doesn't matter. These children don't care about debates. They care about balance beams made of fallen logs and pretending that a patch of grass is a kingdom to be conquered. You sit on a low wall watching, and for the first time feel the faint stirrings of relief, the kind that comes from seeing the future literally run around your feet, unburdened. A boy bumps into you accidentally, apologizes with exaggerated politeness, and runs off declaring a duel of sticks with his friend. A girl laughs so hard she nearly falls into the stream, and the water ripples like a mirror reflecting hope. You breathe in the scent of wet earth and grass, of children's hair smelling faintly of hay and mischief, and realize that this is the village's real recovery, not in grain stores, taxes, or laws, but in the simple, chaotic, unstoppable force of life that refuses to be cowed. Even the animals sense it. Goats bleat with more bravado, chickens strut with newfound authority, and the dogs bark with purpose that is neither fear nor hunger, but something closer to pride. You notice the adults watching from doorways, smiles tentative, some shaking their heads in disbelief. They see the future walking, running, tumbling, and they allow themselves cautiously to imagine laughter that isn't tinged with dread. A young mother calls her children in for supper, and for a moment, the day holds perfectly still, the kind of stillness that comes only when survival has passed the baton and can finally exhale. You stand, brushing mud from your boots, feeling the same mixture of awe and exhaustion. The children don't know it yet, but they carry both the scars and the lessons of those who came before. Their games, their songs, their fearless antics are the living testament to life after famine, messy, resilient, absurd, and utterly unstoppable. And you realize that watching them, laughing alongside them, is its own kind of nourishment, richer than any bread that ever rose from the soil. By mid-morning, you wander past the newly rebuilt workshops and find the air thick with sawdust, smoke, and something that smells faintly of burnt leather. Proof that the village is not just surviving but daring to make. Blacksmiths pound on glowing metal with the rhythmic ferocity of someone keeping the world at bay, while carpenters measure and saw, occasionally muttering to themselves in a language that sounds suspiciously like complaints, but is probably just ritualized frustration. Tools that once sat abandoned in rotting sheds now hum with potential, their steel edges reflecting sunlight and ambition in equal measure. Historically, one mainstream fact fits neatly here. After the Great Famine, many European villages saw a resurgence of specialized trades, as labor shortages forced survivors to diversify skills. Blacksmiths, weavers, and carpenters became essential not just for repair, but for innovation. You watch a weaver trying to fashion a new kind of rope, muttering about knots that refuse to obey the laws of physics. A child tugs at the corner of the loom, asking whether the threads will sing like the fiddler again. You laugh softly, remembering the songs of survival from the other week. Some trades are reborn with a sense of sacred absurdity. Shoe repair involves rituals like tapping each new boot 3 times against the doorframe for luck, and one man insists that polishing a scythe requires a whispered apology to the last person it struck. Quirky tidbits abound. In certain post-famine villages, blacksmiths would secretly craft tiny charms or talismans into tools, believing it would bring good harvests or ward off misfortune. Sometimes it worked. mostly by boosting confidence, which is surprisingly effective. Scholars still debate whether these folk practices were purely superstitious or played a subtle role in reinforcing communal bonds and morale. You peek into a pottery shop where clay figures of chickens, cows, and the occasional dragon sit drying on racks. The potter, an eccentric old man, explains that he makes dragons to remind people that fear is only useful if it's imaginative. You nod, because that actually makes sense in a world where children are practicing swordplay with sticks and adults are plotting how to survive the next storm. Out on the streets, a cart laden with tools tips over, scattering hammers, nails, and a particularly stubborn rolling pin. The baker mutters something about new trades stealing attention from old bread, and you can't help but laugh. Even survival has its petty rivalries. A carpenter demonstrates a new kind of hinge to a skeptical farmer, while a blacksmith offers to enhance the farmer's plow with a bit of extra metal that may or may not double as a musical instrument. Someone taps out a rhythm with a hammer. The chaos feels intentional, almost celebratory. These forgotten trades, you realize, aren't just about utility, they're about reclaiming agency, proving that hunger didn't erase skill or ambition. Even the simplest repair is a triumph over despair. You wander toward the tannery, where hides are stretched and salted, and the smell makes your stomach twist in gratitude and disgust simultaneously. A young apprentice demonstrates how to soften leather, grinning at the adults who look on with awe. "If I can make gloves that don't pinch," he declares, "maybe the world will forgive us." You smile at the ridiculousness of hope, because hope in this village is always a little absurd. Night falls, and torches illuminate sawdust motes dancing like fireflies around the workshops. You pause to listen. The rhythmic pounding, the hum of looms, the occasional bark of a dog, the laughter of a child slipping through the alleys. It's a symphony of survival, a noisy declaration that life continues despite everything. Somewhere behind you, the blacksmith whistles a tune you recognize from the market songs, now with a new verse about crooked nails and heroic goats. You hum along quietly, feeling warmth creeping into your bones. Forgotten trades, you realize, are not forgotten at all. They've merely been waiting for someone stubborn enough to care. And in this village, stubbornness is a survival strategy as essential as any grain stored in a granary. By the time the first heat of summer rolls into the village, there's talk of celebration, and you feel a flutter of disbelief in your chest. After years of famine, fear, and whispered curses, someone actually wants to throw a festival. You walk through the main square and see banners, threadbare but colorful, strung between cottages, their edges fraying like memories clinging to hope. Tables groan under the weight of food, not enough to rival a noble's feast, but far more than anyone dared imagine last year. The smell of roasted roots, sweet grains, and smoky meat drifts through the air, mixing with laughter in a way that almost makes your chest ache. Historically, one mainstream fact fits here. Post-famine Europe saw a resurgence of local festivals and communal gatherings, as villages sought to reinforce social bonds, celebrate survival, and mark the passing of hunger. Music, dance, and ritual feasts became a collective statement. We endure. You watch a fiddler begin to play, a little off-key as villagers form an awkward circle to dance. Children skip and trip over each other, adults sway hesitantly, and one elderly man waves a walking stick like a baton, conducting chaos rather than music. Someone attempts a leap over a roasting spit, lands in a puddle, and the crowd cheers. You laugh despite yourself. Joy has always been a messy endeavor. Quirky tidbits abound. In some regions recovering from famine, people would smear ash or flour on their faces during festivals to honor both the dead and the living, symbolically blending grief with celebration. You notice a young woman with streaks of white across her cheeks, grinning at her partner. Scholars still debate whether these customs were merely symbolic or functioned as a form of social therapy, helping villagers process trauma collectively. The ritual seems practical and emotional all at once. You stomp, clap, and twirl, and each movement feels like shaking off the ghosts of last year. Food is passed around haphazardly: bread, cheese, small roasted birds, and there's a game involving tossing apples into baskets that seems invented purely to elicit laughter. A boy runs around pretending he's a plague spirit, and the adults, instead of scolding him, cheer on his performance with mock terror. Someone carries a small barrel of ale through the crowd, the spillage coating toes in sweet, muddy syrup. You stick a hand in it anyway. The festival feels like a rehearsal for life itself, imperfect, loud, and wonderfully absurd. A storyteller begins recounting tales of survival, exaggerating details to the point that you can't tell what's real. A woman whispers to you that her father once tried to turn a cow into a musical instrument during the famine. You snort, almost dropping your mug. In the distance, the priest arrives, carrying a candle and looking suspiciously like he wants both to bless and to judge the festivities. He settles for nodding at the crowd, muttering about moderation while secretly tapping his foot to the fiddler. By nightfall, lanterns are lit, smoke curling from small fires, and everyone sits in circles humming the songs of survival you've heard before. Children lie sprawled in the grass, counting stars, their eyes wide with possibility. Someone passes around roasted apples. Another person tells a joke so bad it becomes the highlight of the evening. You feel warmth, real warmth, not just from the fires radiating through the crowd. The festival isn't perfect. It's muddy, noisy, and chaotic, but it is proof that the village is alive. And as you sit back, letting the music, laughter, and occasional howls of dogs fill the night, you realize that survival isn't merely the absence of famine, it's the noisy, messy, stubborn return of life, a declaration written in song, flower, and mud. The festival carries on late, each laugh and note a small rebellion against memory, and for the first time in a long time the future feels bright enough to almost touch. The next morning you wander past the market and catch sight of the village healer setting up her little stall, a tent made of patched cloth and optimism. She arranges herbs, dried roots, and strange little bottles filled with liquids that glow faintly in the sunlight. Some smell faintly of sweetness, some like old soil, and a few carry a hint of vinegar strong enough to make your eyes water. The famine left not only empty stomachs but weakened bodies, and villagers are eager for anything that promises to make them whole again. Historically, one mainstream fact fits here. After the Great Famine, folk medicine and herbal remedies became crucial, as formal medical care was scarce and many traditional physicians had perished or abandoned villages. You watch as a mother brings a sick child, trembling as the healer dips a spoon into a brownish potion. "It tastes like hope," she whispers, although judging by the child's grimace, it probably tastes like mud. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some of these post-famine remedies included mashed worms for fever, a practice thought to draw out illness, and the occasional poultice of cow dung for infections. Oddly enough, sometimes it worked, at least if placebo counts. The healer hums softly as she mixes concoctions, chanting what you assume is either an incantation or a grocery list. It's hard to tell. People line up, some genuinely believing, others hoping that action itself might be medicine. Scholars still debate whether folk remedies were genuinely efficacious or primarily psychological, an early version of morale therapy disguised as medicine. You pick up a sprig of mint and smell it. It's fresh, sharp, invigorating, and for a second it feels like the famine never existed. Children crowd around, fascinated by the colors, shapes, and smells, and the healer encourages them to touch and sniff, teaching lessons of resilience and curiosity all at once. You notice that even the adults pause, taking a moment to breathe, to inhale possibility, to pretend that control over their bodies and health isn't entirely lost. One old man mutters that he feels younger already, though it's unclear whether the herbs or the attention is working its magic. You laugh quietly. Healing, it seems, is a mixture of care, showmanship, and stubborn belief. The healer tells stories as she works, explaining which plants grow best in wet soil, which roots ward off nightmares, and which flowers should never be touched if you value your eyebrows. The villagers listen raptly, absorbing not only instruction but the thrill of knowledge reclaimed after famine had stolen so much. There's a sense of ritual, of communal learning, that transforms the mundane task of stirring a potion into a performance, a meditation, a celebration of life itself. Someone hands you a tiny bottle, saying it will help you sleep. You uncork it, sniff, and realize it smells faintly like forest floor and yesterday's bread. You drink anyway. Outside, children play near a small stream, pretending to be apprentice healers themselves, mixing mud, leaves, and water into imaginary cures. Their laughter is unrestrained, infectious, and you realize that the act of making, even if useless, is part of survival. In this village, magic and medicine blend into something practical and symbolic, a way of asserting control over uncertainty. The sun dips low, and you watch the healer pack up, her hands stained, her smile faint but proud. The villagers leave her tent not only with remedies for their ailments, but with knowledge, stories, and tiny pieces of confidence reclaimed from the shadow of famine. As you walk back toward your cottage, the scent of herbs lingers on the wind, mingling with the smell of baking bread and smoke from chimneys. You breathe it in deeply, feeling it press against the hollows left by hunger, and realize that survival is more than nourishment, it is care, attention, and the courage to believe in small miracles even when the world has shown itself unkind. By mid-morning, you find yourself walking along the main road that winds out of the village, muddy and uneven, still scarred by years of neglect. Travelers' carts pass infrequently, squealing wheels announcing news, rumors, and the occasional insult carried from neighboring towns. The famine left not only empty stomachs but empty lanes, so every sound on the road feels significant, as if the earth itself is eavesdropping. Historically, one mainstream fact. After the Great Famine, rural roads were often in disrepair due to neglect and overuse during crises, making trade, communication, and travel difficult for years afterward. You spot a merchant arriving from a distant village, a bundle of herbs strapped precariously to his back, and hear whispers trailing behind him. Some say he carries gold, others that he's cursed. You follow at a distance, curiosity sharpening like a blade. Here's a quirky tidbit. Travelers often carried talismans or charms to ward off famine ghosts and lingering misfortune. Some as small as a carved nut, others as elaborate as a stitched cloth doll. Superstition and commerce mingled freely on these lanes. The merchant sets up a small stall near the inn, attracting a curious crowd. People trade stories and smiles as readily as goods, and you realize how much information flows in these quiet exchanges. News of neighboring harvests, political decrees, and tales of miracle recoveries. Scholars still debate the influence of such informal networks. Were these roads and rumors vital lifelines fostering social cohesion, or merely conduits for superstition, panic, and gossip? Walking further, you notice children skipping along the edges of the path, testing their balance and daring the crows to swoop closer. One boy kicks a stone, which ricochets and narrowly misses an older woman carrying a basket of apples. She mutters under her breath about reckless sprouts, and the merchant laughs, handing her a small sachet of dried herbs as compensation. The road feels alive, a living thread connecting isolated lives, carrying whispers, wind, and occasionally wonder. Somewhere, a dog barks. You follow the sound to a group of young men attempting to construct a crude bridge over a stream. They argue over measurements and methods, each solution more absurd than the last, yet somehow functional. You pause to watch, impressed by both ingenuity and stubborn foolishness, and in the afternoon, a priest passes by, muttering prayers as he walks, eyes flicking suspiciously toward a cluster of travelers with brightly painted carts. "Better bless the roads than curse the harvest," he murmurs. You nod, thinking that perhaps some prayers are more practical than spiritual. By evening, the merchant packs up, leaving behind stories of distant crops, warnings of storms, and rumors of famine still lingering elsewhere. You watch him disappear down the winding lane, carrying both goods and imagination back to a world beyond your village. Standing in the fading light, you realize that roads and rumors, much like the songs, the markets, and the children, are part of the living fabric of post-famine survival, messy, unpredictable, and essential. The path home seems less lonely, the air warmer, and the village behind you alive with anticipation for the next visitor, the next story, the next unexpected miracle carried along its uneven, muddy lanes. By dawn, you wander into the fields once again, this time not just as a passerby but as a student of the land. The soil, dark and forgiving, holds memories of famine in every furrow, and each row you walk feels like a silent lecture. Villagers are already at work, hands bent in the earth, tools scraping, seeds slipping between fingers with almost sacred reverence. You notice the subtle rhythms of their labor, the measured steps, the synchronized digging, the whispered encouragements passed between neighbors, and realize that farming is no longer just about survival. It is education, ritual, and therapy all at once. Historically, a mainstream fact. Post-famine Europe saw significant changes in agricultural practices, including improved crop rotation and the introduction of more resilient grains like rye and oats, a combination of necessity and observation. You crouch down to inspect a row of sprouts, marveling at their stubborn persistence. One of the older farmers notices and mutters, "If they can survive the frost, so can we." The remark is simple, but it carries the weight of decades of suffering. A quirky tidbit: in some villages, farmers would sing to the crops, believing that rhythm and melody encouraged growth, a practice that might be purely psychological but undoubtedly built community morale. You hum along to one of these improvised tunes, feeling a strange connection to centuries of tradition. Scholars debate whether these post-famine agricultural innovations were the result of conscious learning or accidental adaptation. Either way, the fields themselves became classrooms, teaching patience, observation, and resilience. Children run between the rows, mimicking the adults, some carrying tiny baskets, some throwing handfuls of dirt, laughing when the soil sticks to their hair. It's chaos, yes, but it's controlled chaos, a living lesson in the patience and absurdity required to coax life from the earth. You notice one particularly determined girl carefully watering a stubborn patch, whispering encouragement as if the plants can understand her words. You can't help but smile at the dedication, remembering how adults once whispered prayers to the heavens hoping for rain. Now, the hands-on lessons in the field seem more effective, even if slightly comical. A cow wanders past, mooing in a tone that almost sounds like commentary on the villager's technique, and someone throws it a stalk of barley, pretending it's a critic's applause. You pause, letting the sun warm your back, the smell of wet soil and growing things filling your senses. Each furrow, each tiny green sprout, is a testament to endurance, a reminder that the village and its people can still learn, adapt, and grow. By midday, the square is alive with the scent of labor and the quiet pride of accomplishment. Farmers compare techniques, swap advice, and laugh at past mistakes, realizing that knowledge, much like crops, needs to be cultivated, shared, and sometimes fertilized with absurdity. You step back, surveying the fields, the laughter, and the stubborn sprouts, and you realize that education after famine isn't confined to books or sermons. It lives here, in mud-streaked hands, in songs, and in the tireless persistence of life, insisting on continuation. By late afternoon, you find yourself sitting under the shade of a gnarled apple tree at the edge of the village, listening to elders recount stories of neighbors who didn't survive the famine. Their voices are soft, measured, and occasionally interrupted by coughing or laughter at memories too absurd to forget. One man tells of the baker whose oven went cold, and who, in a fit of desperation, tried to teach his chickens to lay bread instead of eggs. They weren't very good at it, he says, chuckling, but the idea was noble. You nod, imagining a flock of chickens puffing up in defiance, and can't help smiling. Historically, one mainstream fact. After the Great Famine, oral history became a crucial tool for preserving memory, passing down lessons about food storage, weather patterns, and community survival to subsequent generations. The elders' stories, while often exaggerated, serve as both entertainment and education. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some villages, people claimed that certain neighbors were touched by luck if they survived when all others around them did not, leading to playful accusations of magical intervention or secret bargains with spirits. You watch the storyteller lean closer, lowering his voice as if the wind itself might carry secrets. Old Mrs. Dingle, he whispers, kept a jar of sunshine water that supposedly kept her vegetables alive through frost. You squint skeptically, but he winks. Worked once. She insists it's why she's still here. Scholars still debate the role of such superstition in post-famine communities. Did it help maintain morale and social cohesion, or did it foster unnecessary fear and isolation? Standing up, you walk toward a small group of children listening intently. They giggle when the elder imitates the farmer tripping over his own plow, and their laughter ripples through the grass like a promise of renewal. Neighbors share practical advice too: which herbs repel pests, how to tell if grain is still good, and when to plant to avoid another disaster. Advice mingles with folklore, creating a tapestry of memory, warning, and humor. By evening, the sun casts long shadows over the village, and the stories wind down. You feel the weight of collective memory pressing gently on your shoulders, a mixture of grief, amusement, and cautious pride. The village has survived, learned, and is teaching the next generation through tales that are as instructive as they are entertaining. You take a deep breath of the apple-scented air, realizing that survival isn't just about crops or food, it's about remembering, laughing, and passing down lessons in ways both practical and ridiculous. The wind carries a faint note of music from the square, and you follow it back home, heart a little lighter, knowing that the village's history now lives in the stories themselves. As dusk drapes itself over the village, you notice a subtle shift in the air. The laughter and songs of the day fade into quiet murmurs, replaced by the careful scraping of boots on muddy streets and the occasional creak of a shutter. Villagers take their positions along the edges of the town, keeping watch over granaries, livestock, and each other. After the famine, vigilance has become second nature, like breathing or arguing over the correct way to roast a turnip. Historically, one mainstream fact fits neatly here. Following the Great Famine, rural communities often established night watches and informal militias to protect against theft, marauding animals, and opportunistic outsiders, effectively blending security with social cohesion. You walk alongside one such group, the torchlight flickering against tired faces, illuminating eyes that have seen hunger, death, and the slow return of hope. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some villages used simple musical instruments, pots, drums, or tin whistles to communicate across long distances during night watches, creating a kind of secret symphony only the locals could interpret. A particularly inventive lad taps a tin on a fence post, sending a rhythmic message that only the neighbors recognize. All quiet, except the cat. Scholars still debate whether these early night watch systems were motivated more by genuine necessity or by the social pressure to appear responsible. You can see both at play as you pass a man pacing nervously, muttering about a missing loaf of bread, while his partner rolls her eyes knowing he's half worried, half pretending competence. The night hums with both tension and reassurance. Children, of course, peek from windows, trying to see without being seen, while the elders recount stories of past thefts, lost livestock, and a particularly audacious goat that allegedly outran 3 men in a single night. You chuckle at the absurdity. remembering similar tales from the markets and festivals. The torchlight flickers again, revealing shadowed corners where cats, rats, and the occasional fox lurk, and the villagers' vigilance seems simultaneously overcautious and entirely necessary. You find a quiet spot and watch as the moon climbs, bathing the town in silver light. Each torch, each creaking shutter, each whispered warning is a thread in the tapestry of survival. Even the air feels alive with collective alertness, a pulse born from the memory of scarcity. By the time the watch ends, the village settles into a tentative calm, and you realize that vigilance isn't just about guarding resources, it's about guarding hope, sanity, and the faint spark of normalcy that survived the famine. You take a deep breath of cool night air, letting it mingle with the faint scent of embers, and feel the strange comfort of shared responsibility. In this village, survival is not solitary. It's a chorus of caution, absurdity, and care, sung quietly under the stars. The next morning, you wander into the corner of the village, where craftsmen are busy shaping tools, baskets, and furniture. The rhythmic tapping of hammers and the soft scrape of knives filling the air like a makeshift orchestra. After the famine, survival depended not just on grain, but on the clever use of whatever materials remained. Broken wheels are reforged, scraps of leather patched into boots, and fallen branches transformed into rudimentary furniture. You pause to watch a blacksmith hammering a horseshoe while simultaneously lecturing a boy on the correct angle for bending iron. His teaching style is part showmanship, part sheer exasperation, and completely captivating. Historically, one mainstream fact. In post-famine Europe, artisanal skills saw a revival as labor shortages and the need for practical solutions encouraged innovation, improvisation, and multi-skilled artisanship. People had to be creative, and necessity often became the mother of slightly eccentric inventions. A quirky tidbit: some post-famine blacksmiths and carpenters would add small charms, bits of ribbon, carved faces, or twisted wire into the finished goods, claiming they brought luck to both maker and user. Skeptical or not, these little touches offered psychological comfort and a sense of control in uncertain times. Scholars still debate whether such embellishments were merely superstition or whether they played a subtle role in reinforcing social bonds and trust within communities. You wander past a weaver stretching coarse thread across a loom, watching patterns emerge like small triumphs. A child imitates him, creating an uneven but spirited version, and the weaver laughs, clapping his hands in delight. The act of teaching, crafting, and sharing knowledge feels almost sacred, a communal reclaiming of skills that famine tried to strip away. You notice the smell of sawdust, wet leather, and warm metal mingling in the morning air, a scent that carries both nostalgia and anticipation. People joke, argue, and teach in tandem, their voices forming a lively backdrop to the clattering and scraping. A young woman shows a man how to splice rope, only for the rope to snap, sending them both stumbling into a heap of tools and laughter. Despite the minor mishap, they cheer the rope anyway, celebrating not perfection but effort. By midday, the workshops seem alive with purpose: baskets ready to carry crops, repaired carts waiting to travel muddy lanes, and sturdy shoes promising better footing in unpredictable fields. You realize that crafting here is as much about rebuilding confidence and community as it is about utility. Each hammered nail, woven basket, and repaired wheel signals not just survival but optimism, stubbornly persistent and occasionally absurd. As the sun tilts toward evening, the craftspeople begin to tidy their spaces, stacking tools carefully and admiring their handiwork with satisfaction. Children follow along, pretending to help, carrying scraps that serve as both practice and play. You take a deep breath of the warm, dusty air, feeling the pulse of life returning in a rhythm forged by labor, laughter, and creativity. In this village, survival is tangible. In the wood, the metal, the thread, and the smiles of people who insist on making life not only livable but, occasionally, beautiful. By the following afternoon, you find yourself gathered near the old stone well, where a circle of elders has convened to share advice with anyone willing to listen. Their voices are soft but carry the weight of decades spent navigating hunger, loss, and the slow, awkward return of hope. You sit cross-legged on the damp grass, listening as one elderly man recounts a story about a neighbor who buried his last loaf during the famine, only to dig it up months later and find it sprouted into a tiny edible plant. The crowd laughs, some out of disbelief, some out of recognition that this is exactly the kind of ridiculous ingenuity that saved lives. Historically, one mainstream fact. Elders in post-famine European villages played an essential role in passing down practical knowledge, crop rotation, soil management, food preservation techniques, as well as moral guidance and cautionary tales about scarcity. Their advice was as much about survival skills as it was about resilience. You notice a young woman leaning in, scribbling notes in a crude notebook, perhaps the first in a long line of literate record keepers attempting to preserve oral knowledge. A quirky tidbit surfaces. Some elders claimed that animals, particularly goats and crows, could sense approaching famine and advised planting certain crops accordingly. While this might be superstition, villagers often followed these recommendations with surprising consistency. Scholars still debate whether such folk wisdom held measurable value or primarily functioned as social cohesion, reinforcing trust and hierarchy in communities recovering from famine. The elder continues, speaking of rainwater collection, seed saving, and techniques to ensure livestock survived harsh winters. Every tip, anecdote, and warning is punctuated with jokes, laughter, or exaggerated grimaces, reminding the listeners that even in the most practical knowledge, levity matters. You glance around and see children perched on rocks, mimicking the elders' gestures, absorbing lessons like sponges, while adults nod thoughtfully, recognizing that the old ways have been tested by hardship. The stories flow seamlessly into advice on building more resilient homes, making tools from whatever scraps survived, and preserving grain for unpredictable seasons. Each nugget of wisdom feels like a small treasure, quietly asserting that the community's survival depends not just on crops but on memory, adaptation, and shared experience. As the sun dips lower, shadows stretching across the village, you feel the lingering warmth of communal learning, people teaching, laughing, correcting, and remembering. When the circle finally disperses, you rise, brushing mud from your knees, and sense that the village itself feels steadier, more confident. Knowledge has been passed, history has been honored, and even the air seems lighter with possibility. By nightfall, the lessons of the elders echo faintly in the wind, mixing with the scent of wet earth, smoke, and the promise that survival is not merely physical, but also the careful passing down of wisdom, humor, and hope. By mid-morning, you follow the meandering river that skirts the edge of the village, its waters swollen with melted snow and recent rains. The river, once a source of despair when it flooded the fields during the famine, now hums with quiet promise. Villagers gather along its banks, repairing embankments, planting reeds to control erosion, and fishing with makeshift nets. You kneel to dip your fingers in the cool current, surprised by its liveliness and resilience, a mirror of the village itself. Historically, one mainstream fact: rivers and waterways were crucial to post-famine recovery, providing irrigation, fish, and transportation, while also demanding constant maintenance to prevent crop destruction and soil loss. You watch a group of children tossing small wooden boats into the flow, laughing as the tiny vessels spin and collide. A man nearby murmurs about building channels to redirect water to overworked fields. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some villagers placed carved stones into the river as water guardians, believing that their placement would ensure fish abundance and prevent misfortune. Practices more symbolic than scientific, but oddly comforting. Scholars debate whether such interventions were practical flood management or largely ritualistic. Noting that sometimes superstition and survival coexisted seamlessly, you help a woman secure a leaning fence post by the riverbank, and she tells you stories of how her family survived past floods by floating small boats of stored grain downstream to relatives. You nod, recognizing that ingenuity and tradition intertwine in these waters. Ducks paddle lazily nearby, seemingly judging your efforts, while the children's laughter ripples across the current. Villagers trade advice on fishing techniques, planting schedules, and water conservation, their voices overlapping like chords in an improvised song of reclamation. By late afternoon, the river seems almost domesticated. Reeds stand taller, banks reinforced, and the water flows more predictably, a testament to human persistence and collaboration. You lean against a tree, inhaling the wet, earthy air, and realize that this stream is more than a resource, it's a living classroom, shaping behaviors, community, and understanding of the natural world. As evening falls, the river catches the sunset, flames of gold and orange reflected in gentle ripples, while villagers gather to celebrate minor victories. A successful harvest of watercress, a repaired net, a boat that stayed afloat. You leave the banks with a sense of quiet accomplishment, carrying the lesson that survival often means working with nature's rhythms, learning its language, and finding joy even in the mundane tasks that safeguard life. By late afternoon, the villagers gather once more in the square, this time to celebrate a modest feast, a tangible sign that abundance, albeit fragile, is slowly returning. Tables groan under bowls of stews thick with root vegetables, freshly baked bread, and small portions of salted meat. The smell makes your stomach grumble, a reminder that hunger is no longer the village's constant companion. Historically, one mainstream fact. After the Great Famine, communal feasts became vital to social cohesion, allowing communities to share remaining resources, strengthen bonds, and symbolically mark survival. You watch as neighbors offer portions to those in need, and children help by carrying plates, their hands sticky with breadcrumbs and ale. A quirky tidbit. Some villagers would place tiny figurines or charms made of dough in the center of communal dishes, claiming they would bring luck and ensure future harvests. Mostly symbolic, but taken seriously enough to be carefully preserved until eaten. Scholars debate whether such customs were practical ritual, superstition, or an early form of community building, with some arguing that these feasts reinforced trust networks critical for survival, while others suggest they were mostly morale boosters with little measurable impact on food security. You notice the fiddler from previous festivals perched atop a crate, plucking at strings that sound slightly off-key but full of energy, and villagers join in clapping, stomping, and occasionally laughing so hard they almost drop their spoons. A woman next to you teases the cook about a misshapen loaf, calling it a bread sculpture of doom, and everyone laughs, including the cook, whose pride is only slightly bruised. Children sneak handfuls of apples or stolen rolls, and the adults pretend not to notice because joy is more important than propriety tonight. The priest circulates among the tables, blessing food with a practiced hand, occasionally whispering a joke or shaking a finger at someone daring to reach for an extra serving. You feel a sense of rhythm in the chaos, a pulse that seems to echo through the square and into your own chest. By evening, torches glow warmly, the smell of cooked grain mingling with the smoke of small fires, and villagers settle into the gentle hum of satisfaction. Stories are exchanged. How a cow produced milk after weeks of nothing, how a scarecrow survived the storm, or how a child caught a fish too big for their bucket. You sit back, letting laughter, clinking dishes, and the rich smell of abundance fill your senses. The feast is more than food. It's proof that survival can taste sweet, that people can once again gather without fear, and that life, though fragile, insists on being celebrated. Each bite, each story, each smile is a declaration. The village endured, and now it thrives in small, noisy, joyous increments, one meal at a time. As summer slowly fades, You notice the village adapting to the rhythm of seasons in ways it hadn't needed to for years. Fields are carefully tended, granaries stocked, and livestock moved strategically to pastures that have recovered enough to sustain them. The air is heavy with the scent of ripening crops, sun-warmed earth, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers that have survived on sheer stubbornness. Historically, one mainstream fact: post-famine communities often adjusted planting cycles, diversified crops, and experimented with soil management to prevent another catastrophic failure, gradually creating more resilient agricultural systems. You wander along a path lined with ripening oats, listening to villagers chatter about the best times to sow, harvest, and prepare for winter. A boy runs past, carrying a bundle of wheat, nearly tripping over his own enthusiasm, and someone laughs, warning him to mind the ghosts of last year. A quirky tidbit. In some villages, people marked the changing seasons by small rituals, like tying colored ribbons to fence posts or leaving painted stones at crossroads, believing these gestures encouraged the soil to cooperate and the weather to behave. Scholars debate whether such customs had any practical effect or were largely psychological tools to maintain morale and continuity in post-famine life. You pause by a small orchard, watching as a woman carefully prunes apple trees while explaining to her children how to read the branches and predict fruit quality. Her instructions are detailed and practical, but she peppers them with little stories of mischievous birds, sneaky foxes, and the time a stubborn goat ate half the harvest, blending observation with humor and caution. The village feels alive with movement. Men haul water to fields, women repair tools, and children skip through the dirt, learning skills they will rely on without fully understanding their importance. You notice the subtle patterns of labor, laughter, and learning. A choreography born of necessity and adaptation. Evening descends, painting the sky in muted golds and purples. Smoke rises from cottages, carrying the scent of dinner and firewood. You see villagers sitting quietly outside their homes, enjoying the last warmth of the day, sharing stories, planning, and quietly celebrating survival. The changing seasons are more than weather. They are teachers, guiding the village through cycles of growth, patience, and renewal. You breathe in deeply, feeling the rhythm of life in every breeze, every rustle of leaves, and every faint song drifting from the square. The world once broken by famine now pulses gently with the steady, stubborn insistence of life. Night falls slowly over the village, stretching the shadows of cottages and fields into long, gentle shapes that seem to sway in time with your own breathing. You sit on the doorstep of your little home, the wood still smelling faintly of sawdust and smoke, and watch the soft flicker of torchlight along the main street. The air is calm, carrying the faintest whispers of the river, the laughter of children now tucked into beds, and the distant hum of a fiddle lingering from earlier celebrations. The day's work is done, or as done as it can ever be in a village that survived famine, superstition, and misfortune alike, and you feel a tender kind of exhaustion settling into your bones. The fields, once barren and threatening, now hold gentle waves of grain reflecting the moonlight, a quiet promise of life renewed, resilient, and absurdly persistent. One by one, the villagers retreat indoors, leaving behind the soft patter of nocturnal creatures, the occasional bark of a dog, and the muted sighs of the earth itself as it settles for the night. Historically, the rhythm of post-famine life gradually transformed from frantic survival into a measured, deliberate coexistence with the land and with one another, as communities learned to cherish each day of abundance while honoring the lessons of scarcity. You close your eyes and inhale, tasting the mingled scents of warm bread, wet earth, and the faint sweetness of smoke drifting lazily into the starlit sky. A quirky tidbit flits through your mind. Some villagers believed that if you whispered your gratitude to the wind before sleep, it would carry your blessings to the stars, ensuring a gentle season ahead. Scholars debate whether these customs were genuine spiritual acts or psychological tools. helping villagers cope with trauma and uncertainty, but either way they imbued nightly routines with calm, reflection, and a touch of magic. You think about the laughter, the songs, the feasts, and the ridiculous mishaps that threaded their way through daily survival, and you realize that the village's recovery is both mundane and miraculous. You let the soft darkness envelop you, listening to the gentle stirrings of the night, the river, the wind through reeds, the distant call of an owl, and you feel an unusual serenity, a sense that time itself has slowed to match the patient rhythm of life's return. Every breath, every sigh, every creaking door and swaying branch reminds you that survival isn't just endurance, it's reclamation, adaptation, and small celebrations of absurd, stubborn life. The village sleeps, the fires dim, and the stars shine faintly above, witnesses to a world that has endured and now dreams quietly alongside you. You take one last deep breath of the cool, earthy night, feeling it fill every hollow left by hunger, fear, and loss, softening the edges of memory and allowing gentle warmth to seep in. Time stretches luxuriously, each second lingering with comfort and reassurance, and you let your mind drift over the fields, the laughter, and the rituals that define this reclaimed world. The quiet settles, rhythmic and gentle, lulling both body and spirit into a tender acceptance of what has been endured and what remains. The promise of tomorrow folded softly into tonight. The village, your companions, and the land itself breathe as one, carrying you with them into the deepest, most restorative silence. Sweet dreams,